Well, Shalom from Austin, Texas. This is Rabbi David Hall with Zion Congregation, and we are glad that you showed up for our Bible study tonight. We have a lot of good things to cover, so I'd like to start off with prayer and get right into it. Avinu Shabbat Shamayim, our Father who is in the heavens, we honor you today. We bless your holy name, and we praise you for calling us into your kingdom. Thank you for giving us your instructions in the Torah. Thank you for bringing us into the place of serving you in this community. And you instructed us years ago to stand here, and we have been standing, and we ask you, Lord, that we would be found faithful in our obedience to you. And we thank you for it in the name of Yeshua, the Messiah. The congregation says,
Amen.
Now everybody say, Lord, I'm hungry.
Lord, I'm hungry.
I ask you to feed me.
I ask you to feed me.
And I'm thirsty, Lord.
I'm thirsty.
Give me living water,
Give me living
so I'll have plenty to give to others.
water to give to others.
In the name of Messiah Yeshua.
I
Amen. Baruch Hashem. You know, when we think about what we are supposed to be doing for Yahweh, what can someone do for Yahweh? What's possible for someone to do for Yahweh? Does he have any needs that he cannot meet himself? I guess y'all don't know.
The answer would be there is something he desires.
He absolutely does.
Not prefer to try to give himself.
That's
He would
right.
be the best person.
He has saved some responsibilities for his children. That's me and that's you. So we then become a part of his kingdom, his people, his offspring. So I'm not even sure where the Parsha begins this time. I know we were in 21 last time, and
It's Leviticus
there it is.
25.
Behar,
1.
Leviticus 25. Good. Thank you for that.
This is the last Torah Parashat for the Leviticus.
What's that?
These are the last 4 chapters of Leviticus.
Yeah.
We finished Leviticus today.
All right. So in chapter 25, beginning in verse 1, it starts off once again with our familiar opening, Vaydaber Yahweh el Moshe Behar Sinai Lemor. The only difference that we have this time is that he's telling us that it's in Mount Sinai where he was speaking unto Moses. And he says to Moses, Daber el Bnei Israel ve'amarta. Now, here, this is a little twist on the wording, but it says Dabar, and he says, speak unto Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, and you say to them, unto them, Ki tavo, when you come, El haaretz, to the land which I have given to you, then you shall keep then shall keep the land a Sabbath for unto Yahweh. So one of the things that I've noticed about the land of Israel is that it belongs to Yahweh. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's his. And he lets us use his land. And the conditions are, in other words, you get to rent my property, and the rental is pop. And he tells us what it's going to cost us to rent the property. And so one of the things he says is that the land has to keep a rest, a Sabbath, Shabbat, right there. What's going on with my... For some reason, it seems, there we go. Now maybe it'll work. Shabbat. There we are. I'll lit it up for you. We understand that God wants us to take a Sabbath, but somehow or another it's a little foreign to our minds to think that God wants the land to take a Sabbath, that the land needs to rest. And so one of the things that God is making us aware of is that all the things that belong to God have to have a day of rest or a year of rest. In this case, it'll be a year of rest unto Yahweh. 1 out of 7 years, 1 out of 7 days is a rest unto the Lord for us. 1 out of 7 years is a rest unto the Lord for the land. And it's his land, and he can make the rules up to be whatever he wants to, and he doesn't have to tell us what the reasons are. But we do know, scientifically, it's been shown that land that is allowed to rest once every 7 years just does better. It produces more, and the crops are healthy and abundant, and so causing the Sabbath of the land to come once every 7 years is extremely beneficial to the productivity of the land. He goes on in verse 3, Shesh shanim, 6 years, Tizra, you shall sow, Sadeh, the field, Shadecha, your field, V'shesh shanim, Tizmor, you shall harvest or prune your vineyard and gather the fruit of it. So the land is being instructed, well, God has already put in a pre-design in the land that it's supposed to rest every 7 years. What happens to the land if we don't let it rest? Well, its productivity begins to fall off, and ultimately, if we don't give it the rest that it's been instructed to have, then the land itself will revolt against us, and we will be outcast out of the land. So we get to rest every 7th day, and the land gets to rest every 7th day. And all of the fruit of the land shall be allowed to go, I guess you could say fallow, go back to not be harvested. Whoever's poor, hungry, needing food can eat of it, but it can't be harvested and sold. In the 7th year, Hashvi'it, the 7th year is a Shabbat of Shabbaton. And Shabbaton, as we've told you before, means literally an absolute, non-negotiable rest. It's emphatic. It's got the nun on the end of it, which makes it an imperative. So we see that the Sabbath for the 7th year is imperative, and it shall be unto the land a Sabbath unto Yahweh. Your fields you shall not sow, and your vineyard prune. These are to rest. Anything that comes from the soil. That which grows of its own cord, sepiach, that which grows of its own. You didn't sow to make it happen. You're not cultivating it. You're letting it lay there. That which grows of its own accord of your harvest, you are not to reap it. Tiksur, you shall not reap. And neither the grapes of your vine, which is undressed, in other words, you haven't trimmed its wild branches back, you let it go. Neither you're not supposed to gather. It's a year of rest unto the land. And then in verse 8, and it shall be the Sabbath of the land for you, le'ochelah, to eat for you, and for your avodecha, your servant. Ul amatecha, and for your maid, and for your hired servants, and for your strangers that sojourn with you. And for your cattle, and for the beasts of the field that are in your land, it shall be all of the increase thereof shall be meat for them, shall be food for them. Le'echol, to eat food. Verse 8, V'safarta, and you shall count lecha unto you, Shiva Shabbatot Shanim. There we go. 7 Sabbaths again of years. Every 7th year is a Sabbath year, and you shall count 7 Sabbaths of Sabbath years. Then 7 times, and shall be unto you a space of 7 Sabbaths of years, 9 and 40 years. 49 years. And what happens on the 50th year? In verse, I'm sorry?
Year of Jubilee.
Year of Jubilee. V'ha'avarta, and you shall cause to sound the shofar, teruah. The teruah is the long blast. This is called the Jubilee, but that's not what that word is here. There is a word, Yovel, which is used for Jubilee. And here it says, Teruah is the day of Jubilee. Okay, on the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, it shall be the atonement, and you shall make the sound of the shofar. Notice up here, we have shofar, and down here we have shofar. The teruah is the long sustained notes of the shofar, and you shall make a sound of the trumpet throughout all your land. You shall hallow the year of the 50th year, and proclaim liberty, doror, liberty, in the land unto all of the inhabitants, all who Yoshaveya means he who inhabits, literally translated. And as here we see the word for Jubilee, and it's a Yovel. So the word that they translated previously was not the word for Jubilee, but here it is in Hebrew, Yovel, he, and that means she. So she is a Jubilee. Tiyeh shall be unto you, lechem, to y'all. And ye shall return every man into his possession. So if you've taken land from someone because they have gotten themselves into hot water and you've given them money for the land, then that land has to be returned to them in the year of Jubilee. Every man unto his family ye shall return him. Verse 11, Yovel, a Jubilee. She is the Shanat, a year, Hamishim, 50th year, and here's the word Shana again. And it shall be unto you, not tizra'u, you shall not sow or reap on the that which grows of itself, nor gather the grapes of it with your vine, which has been left undressed, untrimmed, unpruned. Now I'm going to go ahead and go to a easier to read version here for the purpose of making some progress on our time for the evening. That 50th year will be a Yovel for you, a Jubilee. In that year you are not to sow, harvest what grows by itself, or gather the grapes of the untended vine, because it is a Yovel. Every one of you is to return to the land he owns. In other words, Moses gave each family possessions of land in the country. And if it's been sold or been used to redeem someone who is having financial difficulties, then in the 50th year it has to be returned to the family. The family resumes possession of the land. Isn't that a really wonderful thing to take place? I know a lot of people who have gone bankrupt and they've been totally ruined and devastated by it. But God's method of doing it is to restore everything back in the 50th year so that all the families resume the ability to produce income from the crops that land would normally do. And this year of Yovel, every one of you is to return the land he owns. Return to the land he owns. In other words, you got kicked off the land because you sold it, because you had to have a relief from your financial situation, and so now in the 50th year, you're supposed to be able to return to your land. If you sell anything to your neighbor or buy anything from him, neither of you is to exploit the other. Rather, you are to take into account the number of years after the Yovel when you buy the land from your neighbor, and he is to sell to you according to the number of years the crops will be raised. And if the number of years remaining is large, you will raise the price. If it's few years remaining, you will lower it, because what he is really selling you is the number of crops to be produced. So it's to be an entirely, completely, totally, utterly fair system in helping each other through tight financial times. Thus you're not to take advantage of each other, but you are to fear your God, for I am Yahweh your God. Rather, you are to keep my regulations and rulings and act accordingly. If you do, you will live securely in the land. The land will yield its produce. You will eat until you have enough, and you will live there securely. If you ask if we aren't allowed to sow seed or harvest what our land produces, what are we going to eat the 7th year? Then I will order my blessings on you during the 6th year, so that the land brings forth enough produce for all 3 years. The 8th year you will sow seed, but until it grows and produces, you don't have any food from it. So he's planning. He says, I'm going to bless your field so that it will produce for 3 years what it only grows in the 6th year. It'll produce enough for all 3 years. That is, until the produce of the 8th year comes in, you will eat the old stored food. Then the land is not to be sold in perpetuity, because the land belongs to me. You are only foreigners and temporary residents with me. Therefore, when you sell your property, you must include the right of redemption. That is, if one of you becomes poor, sells some of his property, his next of kin can come along and buy back what his relative has sold. If the seller has no one to redeem it, but becomes rich enough to redeem it himself, he will calculate the number of years that the land was sold for and refund the excess to its buyer and return it to his property. If he hasn't sufficient means to get it back himself, then what he sold will remain in the hands of the buyer until the year of Yovel. In the Yovel, the buyer will vacate it, and the seller returns to his property. If someone sells a dwelling in a walled city, he has 1 year after the date of the sale in which to redeem it. For a full year he will have the right of redemption. But if he has not redeemed the dwelling in the walled city within the year, then title in perpetuity passes to the buyer through all his generations. It will not revert to the Yovel. Why do you think that is?
obviously, I should get the microphone for
In this case, there is scripture corresponding in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is commanded by God to purchase land. And it's in relation to what we're reading here. And so I would imagine it means something more to God than what the human mind can conceive. The human mind would conceive it to be something practical.
Okay,
But
well,
to
let's
God,
talk
there's
about
a
it for a
spiritual
second.
element I would like to know.
Let's talk about it for a
Yeah.
second. Okay, so why did someone sell the land to begin with?
Broke, poor, bad business decisions, bad money decisions,
Whatever.
bad crop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hard times.
Yeah.
Okay, so then what value is the land to the new purchaser according to what we read in the scriptures here?
It depends on how the state of the land at that time, too.
So how are we supposed to evaluate the value of the land for the new buyer?
Based on its current condition?
No,
Based on its future condition?
no.
Based on the context of it being God's land and not man's land?
Partially, but it's talking specifically about how many years of crops you can actually get from the land.
Okay.
So it's actually looked upon as an investment property that should pay for itself.
Okay.
So what if you buy a house inside of a city, a walled city?
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between doing that and buying this other piece of land that was out in the fields?
It back then changes the value of the investment of the property, because if you're in a walled city, you're obviously going to be constrained from an agriculture sense, whereas if you're outside the gates, you're able to plant, you're able to
Exactly.
harvest, you're able to.
So it has to do with the productivity of the land and how much crops you can expect during the time of the sale. Now, here's a young man who got in trouble, and it's 20 years into the Jubilee. That leaves 30 years of crops that this land can make before it reverts back to the owner.
Mm-hmm.
So you say, okay, this much land produces this many crops. And so during the Jubilee, he's going to get 30 years worth of crops off of the land, and therefore I'm going to estimate the value of the land at what the land will produce, which is the approximate amount of value for the crops that are going to be planted.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's barley or whatever the crop might be, what will happen is it will have a certain value to it. And you know that it's, let's say you've got 300 acres, okay?
Right.
So you know you can get X number of bushels of grain, for example, off of this much land for this many years. And knowing that the average price of grain is thus and such, then you can say, okay, the value that he should get from the land is this much.
So,
And he has a right to get that value out of the land.
and in this case, because there's so much information that could vary that price in that context, is the person in this case who is getting the land in this example have the right to, I guess, hire someone back then to appropriate that information, to appropriate the value?
Well, there were people who do that all the time there, yes.
Yeah, okay. I was curious about
So just go down to one of the local Pharisees, he'll tell you what it's worth.
that. Was that seriously though,
Yes.
something the Pharisees would do?
Well, all of the land records were kept at the city of Jerusalem.
Right, which means...
So you can know exactly how much land it is without even having to hire a surveyor, because it's in the records for the land of Israel at the capital, which would be Jerusalem. And so the productivity of the land is pretty well understood because they pay tithes on that produce from the land year by year.
Okay.
So they know exactly what the 10% is. So that means they know what the 100% is.
So now bringing this to current, since Israel has been just established past 50 years and we just had a year of Jubilee, are they in Israel, as far as you're aware, reestablishing those records in that method process? And if so, how does that correspond with the conflict they currently have with the Palestinians and the current?
Well, because I don't live in the land of Israel and haven't actually experienced any of this or know people who have experienced it,
Okay.
I can tell you that they are attempting to keep these instructions.
Okay.
Okay? So, historically, when Israel got taken into captivity, it's because they stopped keeping the year of Jubilee.
Right, and a bunch of other commandments, and on top of that, God gave them multiple warnings through Ezekiel, through Jeremiah, through multiple other signs and wonders. He put up with their stubbornness, king after king, generation after generation, till finally he just had enough of it.
Right. And once they crossed over a certain amount, then the land itself would reject the people of Israel out of the land.
Right.
And so it's because it's based upon the number of Sabbath years that it was not allowed to rest.
Right.
So that's how it was based. Now, as we think about these things, if someone sells a dwelling, for example, in 29, in a walled city, he has 1 year after the date of the sale in which to redeem it. For a full year, he will have the right of redemption. That means that if he gets enough money to come back in and purchase the house back, he can do that. And it'll be based upon the right of redemption and how many years it is to the year of Jubilee.
And then if that person trying to buy back the property in this example has conflict with the current owner at that time, he can then turn to the temple or the court to
Supervise.
bring up those papers and say no, those numbers don't match.
Right.
Okay.
So it should all be fair. That was the main thing, is that God wanted everybody to treat everyone else fairly.
Right.
If he has not redeemed the dwelling in the walled city within a year, and that's within a walled city, and so a house that's within a walled city isn't going to have the value of say a ranch out in the middle of the fields.
Right.
Okay. So if he has not redeemed it within a year, then the title in perpetuity passes to the buyer through all of his generations. So he then inherits it. It becomes his inheritance.
Right.
It will not revert in the Yovel. However, houses in villages not surrounded by walls are to be dealt with like the fields in the countryside. They may be redeemed before Yovel, and they revert in the Yovel. Concerning the cities of the Levim and the houses in the cities they possess, the Levim are to have a permanent right of redemption. If someone purchases a house from one of the Levim, then the house is to be sold in the city where he owns property will still revert to him in the Yovel, because the houses in the cities of the Levim are the tribe's possession among the people of Israel. So I always had some confusion about this. I want to see what you think of it. The Levites, it is said, were not supposed to have an inheritance. Is that true or false?
Yes and no.
Is that true or false? There's not a yes or no answer.
It is true.
Okay.
It is true, but there is a lot more to it.
Are there houses included in the blessing or the inheritance that they possess? Why? Why? Since they were not supposed to have an inheritance, why do they get houses as an inheritance.
And service and work of God. It's
Okay, everything has to do with agriculture.
okay.
Agriculturally speaking, the house that's in the city or a house that's in the field, it's on the property that someone owns, that is a part of the inheritance of the land. So it would automatically have to go back to the owners, original owners in the jubile. In the house of the Levim, they have no inheritance, but it's not talking about having no inheritance of a house, for example. Would a Levi be able to pass his house down to his children as a inheritance? And the answer to the question is yes, they can, because the Levim are under a different rule than the general rules for Israel. And so they may have sheep. They may even have a small piece of land for raising the sheep on and taking care of their entrustments. It is reported that the Levites had areas where they were raising sheep for the holy days. So they would then take the sheep in and exchange. For example, if a farmer came up and he had a lamb and it was turned out to have flaws in it, a defect, then he can't use it. It's not able to be used for a sacrifice unto Yahweh. So what does he have to do? He's going to have to exchange that for one without a flaw. Does this make sense?
Yes.
So where will they get the one without the flaw? Well, the Levites raised lambs for that purpose, so that they could then make an exchange and get a little bit of a living from having swapped out the lambs that were not kosher for sacrificing. So if they have sickness in their body, or if they got a lame leg, or they got the wounds in their body that haven't healed right, or whatever, then the Levites had the lambs there for exchanging, so that the people would have something to sacrifice to the Lord. Okay. Why do you think that Yeshua went into the city of Jerusalem and turned over the money exchangers' tables?
Because they were not being fair.
Right, they were overcharging for exchange rate. And why do they need to exchange money in the temple? Why would they have to exchange the money from, say, Roman Empire to the Israeli shekels? Well, because these coins from the Romans had gods printed all over them, pagan deities, and they couldn't be used in the temple in any way. So the Levites would be there to exchange money for the use in the temple, and they made a little something on the side for having done that. However, if they began to charge too much for their exchanges, then God didn't like that. And that's why Yeshua turned over their money changers' tables. Okay? Does that make sense? Comments or questions? Some of you looking at this like a calf looking at a new gate, doesn't know what to do with it.
No comment.
Okay. Anybody having, we don't have any of the chat room anymore. Okay, so we have, the rules are a little different for the Levites as compared to the typical Israeli citizen. What was that about?
No, continue. How's
Okay. Okay, so you can see that because the farmers out in the fields that have houses there on their lands, they would have to have a little different rules for
Value.
for the land and the things that their estimations of the values of these things based upon the year of Jubilee. If someone purchases a house from one of the Levim, then the house sold in the city where he owns property will still revert to him in the Yovel, because the houses in the cities of the Levim are the tribe's possession among the people of Israel. The fields in the open land around their cities may not be sold, because that is their permanent possession. So there were things going on in the Torah that don't make sense with our Western Gentile mindset of estimations of what constitutes a possession or an inheritance and what doesn't. So the fields in the open land around their cities may not be sold, because that is their permanent possession. If a member of your people has become so poor so he cannot support himself among you, you are to assist him as you would a foreigner or a temporary resident, so that he can continue living with you. Do not charge him interest or otherwise profit from him, but fear God, so that your brother can continue living with you. Do not take interest when you loan him money, or take profit when you sell him food. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt in order to give you the land of Canaan and be your God. Excuse me. If a member of your people became poor among you and sells himself to you as a slave, do not make him do the work of a slave. Rather, you are to treat him like an employee or a tenant. He will work for you until the year of Yovel. Then he will leave you and his children with him and return to his own family and regain possession of his ancestral land. For they are my slaves, who I brought out of the land of Egypt. Therefore they shall not be sold as slaves. Do not treat them harshly, but fear your God. Concerning the men and women you may have as slaves, you are to buy men and women slaves from the nations surrounding you. You may also buy the children of foreigners living with you and members of their families born in your land. You may own these, but you also may bequeath them to your children to own. From these groups you may take your slaves forever. But as far as your brothers and the people of Israel are concerned, you are not to treat each other harshly. Talk, question, comments?
Well, to the Western Gentile mind, this would be the slaves, the whole slavery concept, but most people is misunderstood.
So people complain about Trump not wanting to let people come freely into the country. If we live by Torah's rules, they could be purchased as slaves and they would remain with that owner forever. And their children too. So we don't realize how good we have it in this country. Interesting?
Yeah. But why would you think God would do that or allow that?
Well, because God is just and fair, but he wants his people treated special. He doesn't want us to mistreat our brothers in the land.
But why would he allow anyone to be a slave on a perpetual forever basis?
Well, because they don't have a right to an inheritance in the land, so they become a part of the property of the owner of the land, and thereby have a permanent means of income for their family, so that they can have food to eat and clothes to wear, and their children can go to school and learn and whatnot. So it gives them the benefits of being a little bit more than just a resident in the land. a foreign resident here. It's a little bit better. So, verse 4.
But then when they were, from this point, captured in by Babylon and were spread out across the nation, is this also going to be applied in Israel? Would they look upon us in this context?
Well, all nations
Or
did
is it-
during biblical days. All nations had essentially similar rules that they lived by for owning slaves and so forth. Verse 47, if a foreigner living with you has grown rich and a member of your people has become poor and sells himself to this foreigner living with you or to a member of the foreigner's family, he may be redeemed after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his uncle's sons may redeem him, or any near relative of his family may redeem him, or if he becomes rich, he may redeem himself. He will calculate with the person who bought him the time from the year he sold himself to him to the year of Yovel, and the amount to be paid will be according to the number of years of his time at an employee's wage. If many years remain, according to them, he will refund the amount for his redemption from the amount he was bought for. In other words, you're going to balance these books out and make them fair. If there remains only a few years until the Yovel, then he will calculate with him according to his years, and he will refund the amount of his redemption. He will be like a worker hired year by year, and you will see to it that he is not treated harshly. If he has not been redeemed by any of those procedures, nevertheless, he will go free in the year of Jubilee, he and his children with him. For me, the people of Israel are slaves. They are my slaves, who I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh, your God. Now, most people don't consider that the children of Israel leaving Egypt would become slaves to Yahweh. But we are. We are his slaves, his bondservants. He bought us. You are not to make yourselves any idols, erect a carved statue or a standing stone or place any carved stone anywhere in your land in order to bow down to it. I am Yahweh your God. Keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary, for I am Yahweh. And then continuing on into the next parsha, which what we've got is...
It's barely gonna be 8 o'clock.
Huh?
What are you looking at?
We got to go all the way down to 34, which is the last chapter, right?
You mean 28?
I'm in 26,
27,
right.
sorry, 27. Yeah, we finished at
27 and 34. Okay, that's through the end of chapter 27.
Yeah, so we've got technically
26 and 27.
a chapter and a half to go.
Right. If you live by my regulations, observe my mitzvot, and obey them, then I will provide the rain you need in its season. The land will yield its produce, and the trees of the field will yield their fruit. Your threshing time will extend until the grape harvest, and your grape harvesting will extend until the time for sowing seed. And you will eat as much food as you want and live securely in your land. I will give shalom to the land. You will lie down to sleep unafraid of anyone. I will rid the land of wild beasts. The sword will not go through your land. You will pursue your enemies, and they will fall before your sword. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000. For your enemies will fall before your sword. I will turn toward you and make you productive and increase your numbers, uphold my covenant, and uphold my covenant with you. You will eat all you want from last year's harvest and throw out what remains of the old to make room for the new. There's going to be food left over. I will put my tabernacle among you. I will not reject you, but I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt so that you would not be their slaves. I have broken the bars of your yoke so that you can walk upright. But if you will not listen to me and obey all these mitzvot, if you loathe my regulations and reject my rulings in order to obey all of my mitzvot, but cancel my covenant, then I, for my part, will do this to you. I will bring terror upon you, wasting disease and chronic fever to dim your sight and sap your strength. You will sow your seed for nothing, and because your enemies will eat for nothing, because your enemies will eat the crops. I will set my face against you. Your enemies will defeat you. Those who hate you will hound you, and you will flee when no one is pursuing you. If these things don't make you listen to me, then I will discipline you 7 times over for your sins. I will break the pride you have in your own power. I will make your sky like iron, your soil like bronze. You will spend your strength in vain because the land will not yield its produce, or the trees in the field their fruit. Yes, if you go against me and don't listen to me, I will increase your calamities 7-fold according to your sins. I will send wild animals among you. They will rob you of your children, destroy your livestock, and reduce your numbers until your roads are deserted. If, in spite of all this, you refuse my correction and still go against me, then I too will go against you. And yes, I will strike you 7 times over for your sins. I will bring a sword against you, which will execute the vengeance of the covenant. You will be huddled inside your cities, and I will send sickness upon you, and you will be handed over to the power of the enemy. I will cut your supply of bread so that 10 women will bake your bread in one oven and dole out your bread by weight, and you will eat but not be satisfied. And if for all this you still will not listen to me but go against me, then I will go against you furiously. And I also will chastise you 7 times more for your sins. For you will eat the flesh of your sons, and you will eat the flesh of your own daughters. I will destroy your high places, cut down your pillars, your sun worship, and throw your carcasses on the carcasses of your idols, and I will detest you. I will lay waste your cities and make your sanctuaries desolate, so as not to smell your fragrant aromas. I will desolate the land so that your enemies living in it will be astounded by it. I will disperse among the nations, and I will draw out the sword in pursuit after you. Your land will be desolation, and your cities a wasteland. Then at last the land will be paid its Sabbaths. There you go. This is going to happen because we haven't allowed the land to keep its Sabbaths. Yes, as long as it lies desolate, it will have rest. The rest it did not have during your Sabbaths when you lived there. As for those of you who are left, I will fill their hearts with anxiety in the lands of their enemies. The sound of a driven leaf will frighten them so that they will flee as one flees from the sword and fall when no one is pursuing. Yes, with no one pursuing, they will stumble over each other as if fleeing the sword. Pretty heavy threat, isn't it?
Yeah.
You will have no power to stand before your enemies. Did you need something?
The Wirecast froze. It's not following you.
Okay.
Give it a second.
And among the nations you will perish, and the land of your enemies will devour you. Those of you who remain will pine away in the lands of your enemies from guilt over your misdeeds, and those of your ancestors. Then they will confess their misdeeds and those of their ancestors which they committed against me in their rebellion, and they will admit that they went against me. And at that time I will be going against them, bringing them to the lands of their enemies. But if their uncircumcised hearts will grow humble, and they are paid punishment for their misdeeds, then I will remember my covenant with Yaakov, also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. For the land will lie abandoned without them, and it will be paid its Sabbaths while it lies desolate without them. They will be paid the punishment for their misdeeds, because they rejected my rulings and loathed my regulations. Yet in spite of all of that, I will not reject them when they are in the lands of their enemies, nor will I loathe them to the point of utterly destroying them, and thus break my covenant with them, because I am Yahweh their God. Rather, for their sakes, I will remember the covenant of their ancestors, which I brought out of the land of Egypt, with the nations watching, so that I might be their God. I am Yahweh. These are the laws and the rulings and teachings that Adonai himself gave to the people of Israel on Mount Sinai through Moses. Chapter 27, Yahweh said to Moshe, tell the people of Israel, if someone makes a clearly defined vow to Yahweh to give him an amount equal to the value of a human being, the value you are to assign a man between the ages of 26 and 60 years is to be 50 shekels of silver, 1¼ pounds, with the sanctuary shekel being the standard. If a woman, 30 shekels. If it is a child, 5 to 20 years old, assign the value of 20 shekels for a boy and 10 for a girl. If a baby, 1 month to 5 years, let's see, there it is. If a baby, 1 month to 5 years of age, 5 shekels for a boy and 3 for a girl. If a person is past 60, 15 shekels for a man and 10 for a woman. If a person is too poor to be evaluated, set him before the Kohen, who will assign him a value in keeping with the means of the person who made the vow. If the vow is for the value of an animal, of a kind used when people bring an offering unto Adonai, all that person gives of such animals to Yahweh will be holy. He is not to exchange or replace it by substituting a good animal for a bad one, or vice versa. If he does make such a substitution, both the original animal and the one placing it will both be holy. If the animal is an unclean one, such as may not be used in offering to Yahweh, he must sell it before the Kohen, and the Kohen is to set a value on it in relation to its good and bad points. The value set by the Kohen will stand, but if the person making the vow wishes to redeem the animal, he must add 1/5 part to your valuation. When a person consecrates his house to be holy for Yahweh, the Kohen is to set a value on it in relation to the good and bad points, and the value set by the Kohen will be stand. If the consecrator wishes to redeem his house, he must add 1/5 to the value you have set on it, and it will revert to him. Any comments or questions so far?
Wasn't it the responsibility of those who follow after Torah and seek after God to consecrate their homes anyway?
Well, yes and no. This is talking specifically about vowing vows to God.
Voluntarily.
Uh-huh.
Of their own free will.
Let's say you've got a business going and you want this business to prosper. So you can make a vow to God and say, Father, if you will cause my business to prosper in thus and such a way, then I will give to you thus and such. So that would be a vow that you would have to pay to Yahweh because he's going to prosper you. And when he does prosper you as agreed upon, then you owe him the vow. If you don't pay the vow, not a good idea.
But these vows would have to be done with witnesses in this context to validate it.
Possibly.
That's something here I wasn't clear about. Is this to be done in private? Or were
It
there
has to be
witnesses?
spoken with the mouth, okay?
Right, but even if spoken with the mouth, there have to be witnesses.
It doesn't say.
Yes. It does have to be witnessed.
Okay. So
But-
you said it doesn't. So can you expand on
But
that?
if you made that vow personally between you and Yahweh, Yahweh witnesses it. Does that make sense?
Okay, and that's a completely separate kind of vow than the vow being mentioned here.
Right.
The vow being mentioned here is with, in this case, the Kohanim of that time be witness.
Right.
Okay. And so again, this is where I'm seeking to understand the mindset back then of someone who would do this that obviously God felt, or God knew would need to be addressed with Moshe beforehand, which is I'm sorry, Bob, I guess I'm not understanding the mindset of a person who would do this over doing it in private with God. I'm not quite understanding what is the mindset here. What is there to gain? Are they thinking that by doing this with the Kohanim as witness rather than private with God, that they're either too meek or too humble, or that are not worthy, or that they're over prideful? I'm trying to understand. what is
Everything
the
has
heart.
to do with a court of law.
Okay.
Everything has to do with having a witness who can testify that the things that you're saying are true.
But then why would you then do it in private if that's the case? I guess the mindset is a legalistic person versus somebody who completely lives by faith.
I don't think you're quite getting it, but
I'm not.
Okay.
Again, this is something that I've mostly glazed over the last few years because I still cannot seem to grasp my mind around the kind of person whose mindset goes through doing this.
Well, I'll tell you, I have known people who have made vows to God.
Mm-hmm.
I will give you $1,000 a month. Okay? No, wait a minute. You don't know if you're going to have $1,000 a month coming in. So you can't make that kind of a promise.
All right.
I know that if you bless my business to the degree that I can give $1,000 a month, I will do that. But how can I promise for something that I don't have a surety on?
Mm-hmm. So would this be for someone whose mindset is to make a vow based on certainty rather than faith by itself in context?
Well, it's an act of faith to vow to God.
Right. Well, yes, and then yet there's also the mindset of man who seems good in his own sight, but it's not in the eyes of God, and that is someone who's trying to bribe God. And I'm trying to understand, is this addressing that, the heart of one who wants to bribe God, who wants to
No, it's just
Twist his
saying that
arm
you
for-
need to pay your vows. If you make a vow to God, then you have to pay your vows. And if you renege on your vow, you need to add a fifth part to it.
okay.
That's a 20% interest.
But again, in order for this to be enforced, it would have had to have been witnessed in the first place
Yes,
by the Kohanim in this context.
right.
Huh. And so to me, this seems like a way for encouraging a person to try to bribe God in a way.
Well,
Because if you're
it's
following
not
Torah
a
and
bribe.
faithful,
You're
You've already
asking
got
God
the-
for a blessing, and you're telling Him in response to His answer for your prayer that you're going to do thus and such for Him.
but don't you
But-
already have the blessings prior to this by following His commandments? That
Yes,
should cover all these other needs. So
but
why
the
need to do
vow
this?
is a separate thing, a step beyond. Beyond it.
So you're saying that
What I suggest is that if you want to make a vow to God, then give Him a percentage of what your blessings you're expecting to be from it, a percentage of it. Say, if you will bless me with the proceeds from this business, then I will give you an extra 10% of the money that comes in. That's safe. You can do that. But you can't do that if you say, I vow an extra $1,000 a month to you for giving me this blessing. You can't do that vow because you don't know if you're going to have it to give each month or not. Mr. Spears?
So that's sort of like making an investment.
Yeah.
So to use his perspective, this would be a way for God. This is a way that God is encouraging someone to take an extra step in addition to keeping His
Right.
commandments.
Right.
And you better keep it.
Right.
Not make a vow and not think, oh.
Now, is this also encouraging someone to counsel with the Kohanim in advance? Were the Kohanim in this time, in this context, able to advise someone before making this vow to make adjustments on that vow so it could be kept? Is that something that they would be able to counsel?
I don't know. I
on?
was yawning and my ears kind of tuned out on you for a second there.
Okay. Okay, so my question is, in this context, if a person is wants to make a vow but is unsure the terms and conditions to make before God that they are able to keep, how do they counsel to get those specifics down? With the Kohanim in that time in this
Sure.
context? Okay.
The Kohanim were the bridge. They were the link between God and man.
Okay.
So if you're going to make a vow to God, who are you going to go to? The priest.
That's what their job.
Yeah, that's their
Right.
job.
But now that going into modern times with Yeshua's sacrifice for us, in modern day, how do we keep this?
Well, you can still promise God whatever you want and just expect the Holy Spirit to be the rule in the matter. But you better make sure that you're not vowing something that you're unable to keep.
And who would you
Because-
counsel in this case to ensure you're making a vow
Someone
that
who
you
knows
can't
about
keep?
these matters.
Okay. All right. Okay, that's what I was getting at.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're
for
welcome.
clarifying, because this is something that I've glazed over for years and not really understanding. Also, I've never quite understood why at the end of Leviticus it references to read the entire first book of Yochanan as the suggested Brit Hadashah. Do you have any comment on that while there's still time left? Because we're pretty much done.
I'm actually kind of played out, and
Okay. Because I've never
little-
understood the I guess mindset of picking the entire book of First Yochanan to.
well, if you
Paraphrase.
study it carefully, you'll see the connections.
Okay.
Okay. And if you want to, you can call me anytime and talk to me about it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Well, my body being kind of sort of played out at this point, due to sleep deprivation more than anything else. I think we will call this good for tonight, and hope you got something out of the study.
Absolutely.
And we will see you on Shabbat, and again next Tuesday for another parsha from Scriptures.